Welcome back to the Papers Podcast. We are here again, professionals and academics parsing education research. And I have with me today John.
Hi, Linda. Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Jason.
Hi, everybody.
And Lara, you're also here.
Yes, I am, Linda, although I'm not sure either. I don't know what's going on. Just showing up.
I screwed that up. Okay.
It's fine.
All right. Well, Samuel, we'll cut all this.
We'll
Anyway.
fix it.
I think you should keep it. I think it's cute. And plus, having Lara as an option, that's interesting. We should explore that.
Sorry, I somehow had that feeling that Lara was presenting, so I was going to do her last. But anyway, okay. All right, so welcome back, Lara, Jason, and John. You have something which you claim is a bit different today.
Well, I guess we're a little rusty. We've had our summer hiatus. We're back in the saddle. We're actually back from Amy, where we did 2 live recordings, and I hope you've enjoyed those episodes. But the four amigas, we have a paper that I think it gets into one of the topics that are always a challenge for me. I have this principle in education leadership is spend as much time as you can find on choosing who's on your team. And we're going to talk about resident selection as an example of that this today on the podcast. Now, the point of selecting a resident for inclusion in a resident training part, it's pretty hard to go wrong there. The system has been built for success. By the time you are ready to enter specialty training, there's a maximum selection bias. We already have identified trainees and applicants as bright or even brilliant. They're hardworking. They understand the context. They understand the expectations. They're committed and they're identified within the profession of medicine. But despite all that, if you are a program director or if you have been involved in postgraduate medical education, you know that choosing and selecting residents is hard. It's hard work. In Canada, I think it's increasingly not even a manageable task. Our size of applicant pool is too big, and we only have 17 medical schools. I can't even imagine to begin the challenge at larger jurisdictions where they might have a candidate pool 10x bigger than what we're experiencing here in Canada. And we haven't even begun to embrace this idea of unconscious or institutional bias or the imbalance of supply and demand or south-north migration, costs to fiscal costs or environmental costs to traveling for in-person interviews, the questionable predictive validity of a half-day series of interviews to determine if you're going to be a great candidate, and whether the question of what's your greatest weakness, and FYI, being a perfectionist is not an acceptable answer, is any way to determine whether you'll be a great internist or pediatrician or psychiatrist. It almost begs the question, what the heck are we doing when we select residents for specialty training? Is this not really a process that's doomed? I'd love to get your perspectives. Linda, you've done everything in med ed, and how have you selected? What's worked for you in the past? What are you thinking about in the future?
So I'm not sure I've done everything in med ed, but I certainly have done a lot of selection, both of med students, where I've been able to decline being on a selection committee of white males looking at letters only. And colleagues, we don't think about it, but it's another kind of selection when we're bringing on colleagues to our divisions, where I think it's actually talking to whoever the person's worked with previously. That's good. But my best selection factor is what I call the Elizabeth factor. Now, Elizabeth was our residency program administration person, and she could predict the future course of a resident when they walked in for the interview. Because, of course, the future resident would be really nice to us and put on their best behavior. But if they were rude or ignored or otherwise disrespected Elizabeth, they weren't going to do well. And I think we forget about those types of factors.
Jason, despite my belief in this, at some point somebody selected you. Now, probably they selected you last, just like in gym class in grade 4.
It was a mistake.
So true.
I'd love to hear what the process was like from you, from a first person point of view.
All right. So I have a couple anecdotes. Yes, even my parents told me I was a mistake. And I'm pretty sure I was selected last in med school as a geography candidate. I came from the far north. So I got into emergency medicine because we're doing residency selection today. I got into emergency medicine when there were only 12 spots available for the whole country. It was incredibly competitive. And like many people who are listening to this podcast, you went through a process where you wrote an essay. It's like a humble brag about how you're such a good fit for this specialty and how you discovered it while climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, and he had an epiphany on the peak of K2, all that kind of stuff. Those are hard letters to be authentic about. Fortunately, I stood out in my interviews because I was the only person dumb enough to be doing medical education way back then. And so I was not like everybody else. And somehow I got in. That's crazy. And just before I let go of the mic, I got to tell you, you were talking, John, about how many people to interview. Do you guys know that the genius of MedEd, Eric Warm, interviews every single applicant? He starts something like 9 months ahead of the match. So every week he books off a half day and phones people because he just cares about this topic so much. That's huge.
Eric, shout out to you and your program. That's a lot of work. Jason, I'm glad you're good at MedEd, and it's obvious you're not great at geography despite your geographical candidacy. You know that K2 and Kilimanjaro are separated by 2 continents, but that's for another episode.
But they were separated by 2 paragraphs in my essay.
Okay, fair enough. As a little aside, Lara, I'm coming to you. There is this phenomenon in medical school applications where there's a common anecdote about a lifeguard saving a drowning person as the impetus for them to enter medical school. And the AI has been able to detect this because there's been kind of some back room drafting process for here's the perfect essay to get into medical school. An example of a flawed system. Lara, I can see the look on your face, which is, I have big thoughts about current selection processes. All right, let us have it.
So I'm not sure I have big thoughts about the selection process, John, but I do have, what I have is, I worry that addressing the selection process is an important question. It's one we need to attend to, and it's something that every single institution that works in this medical education space, it's part of the processes of concern that we need to address. My thing, though, is that it's a symptom of a different problem. It's the problem is that UME, we need more physicians in practice. Done. UME is growing, and medical schools are happy to take the tuition dollars of young, enthusiastic applicants and to train them at the UME level, but the GME level has not grown at the same pace. And as a result of that, the UME leaders can put up their hands and say, "Hey, we did our part. We're doing our part." But the GME side can say, "We just can't make more positions available. So, don't look at us like it's our problem." And so who's left holding the bag? It's these students who have gone through this training, who have done this work, and who have absolutely no power to affect the changing in the processes. And so selection becomes this incredibly intense, incredibly competitive, unpleasant, stressful event that is imposed upon them because we within medical education have let the one side of the house grow at whatever level it wants, and the other side of the house hasn't grown to meet it. And somebody out there somewhere is going to say, "Come on, Lara, it's the invisible hand. Let the system grow. It'll eventually, people will say that residents are worth so much, we should create more positions, and that'll sort itself out over time." Yeah, okay, maybe it will. But there's also a lot of research about how much residents actually bring in financially, and there's conflicting reports in there because it really depends on what you take into consideration. The work to maintain accreditation versus how many patients they can see versus all sorts of other things. And so I'm very happy we're going to talk about this. I think it's an important paper, but I hope we all recognize that this is a symptom we're monkeying with. This is not the problem.
Can I just jump in to say that this varies incredibly around the world? We're going to do a little discussion about what's in the literature, but it's very North American heavy, this conversation we're having. And there are some countries where 10% of UME get into further training. Everybody else doesn't get any further training. There's some countries where there is no interview. You're assigned a city and a program and a site, and you're ranked by your exam score post-medicine. So there's lots and lots of systems out there. And I think all of them are flawed, honestly.
Yeah, another system, if you could call it that, is that the chair of the department likes you. The program director has no say in things.
But I do hope, just before you go, John, if we're going to have more UME spots and fewer GME spots in various places around the world, then we have a responsibility to create things like off-ramps where if you're not selected into residency, there's a viable career ahead of you where you can use the skills you've developed. And if we don't think about it in those kinds of ways, then shame on us, because all we've been able to do is to take tuition dollars from a population and then leave them with an empty hat at the end of it. And I don't care where you are in the world. That's shameful.
So as I look at the problem space around residency selection, and we can see that everybody's fired up, and we were worried that maybe this was a topic without enough controversy behind it. I see it as a real challenge. And I've entitled this episode, Resident Selection, A New Hope. A New Hope? I'm not sure. Do the up inflection. All right. A New Hope ? That's what I really want to have. I can't believe we're almost 3/4 through our inaugural year at the Papers Podcast, and we haven't done a Star Wars reference. So let me correct that right now. I feel a little like Princess Leia. And, I'm not on my princess chair today, but I really wish I was, because it would be a perfect metaphor. I feel like I'm in episode 4. I'm signaling Obi-Wan Kenobi, help me research All Stars. You're my only hope. And if you don't know that reference, I'm not sure if we can be friends. Roll with me. Come on, Lava. You know what I'm talking about. And so enter the MedEd Jedis. Holly Creta-Wire,
oh my God.
Kevin Eva, Dan Schumacher, Lainey Yaris, Pim Tunison. They've published a paper entitled Postgraduate Selection in Medical Education, a scoping review of current priorities and values, published in Academic Medicine, EPUB, ahead of press.
Okay, we need to install a cringe meter for when John's doing nerd references like that. We need to put up that's a 9 on the cringe meter.
That's awesomeness. We are inculcating, we are incepting, we're Easter egging Star Wars into this. This is like gold. This is what people are here for, the Star Wars.
Right, or the phone ringing. Either way, it could just go either way.
All right, let's get to the paper. Here's the purpose from the authors. I'm going to quote them. Postgraduate training directors seek ways to feasibly and defensively select candidates, which has resulted in an explosion of literature to identify root causes for the problems observed in selection and to generate solutions. The authors conducted a scoping review to analyze the problems and priorities in the selection literature to explore the implications and to present a research agenda. Essentially what they did is they conducted a scoping review, which I'm going to argue is a very appropriate type of synthesis approach because the literature is massive in this domain. And in the absence of this, if you did your own PubMed search, you would be overwhelmed by the tsunami of stuff coming at you, have a little bit of working memory overload, and quickly give up. So thank you to choosing a way to organize and make coherence out of the literature. And if you're looking for a clear, easy to follow, classically referenced methods sections on scoping reviews, this manuscript has it. And I won't belabor the process. We've talked about scoping reviews ad nauseum previously here on the Papers Podcast. They searched PubMed, Embase, Web of Science, ERIC, Google Scholar, all of it. And they took all types of postgraduate medical education papers, including editorials. And then using Braun and Clark's approach, we've talked about that previously, they did a thematic analysis to identify themes that they saw arising in their methods. So essentially what they had is from their initial search, they had more than 4,200 articles. At that point, I'm saying this is the wrong project for me. I'm walking away. New question, new process. I can't believe they did it. Hats off to the authors. They got the search down to a little over 2,200 articles for inclusion. And then, if you've never seen this before, they did, which is we tried to sample within that. They didn't look at all 2,200 papers. They randomly selected 30 and reviewed those and did an analysis. And then from that, they had additional 50 that they tried to increase variability by looking at issues of where they are published or where they're reporting from or the date of publication range. So they get things that are newer and older. And then they looked at specific context so that they could then expand out. And at that point, after 80 papers reviewed and analyzed, they didn't really have any new themes. And so they did an additional 20 randomly generated from their set of 2,200 to confirm that they didn't have any additional new themes. So that's the methods in a nutshell. I'm going to tell you that I didn't have big problems, but I'd love to hear from Jason, Linda, Lara of any concerns that they might have had with the process or anything that they might want to identify as kind of a really interesting way to approach it.
I'll jump in and say this is an all-star cast. They're all fantastic methodologists. The methodology is beautifully laid out. We've talked about scoping reviews several times. I agree with you, John. It's the right thing to do when you have a huge body of literature that's so diverse. I don't know. I'd love to hear your comments about the sampling. They have a rationale for the sampling. It's a big body of literature. They said they reached saturation. It's 4% of the identified papers. That makes me uncomfortable. And I just wonder whether or not, that there should have been another approach to sampling. I would have been tempted to do more than 100 papers, honestly.
I'll come back. I'll come back and respond to that, but I'll let everybody else have a crack at it first before we get into that comment.
Well, I got to say, I was blown away by the number of papers, and they're only recent papers. I think it's the last 3 years or something like that. They didn't have any old papers in here. So that's a huge body of literature, and I think you have to use some sort of a sampling process here, or you'll be paying 100 research assistants to go through all the papers. So whether this is the best method or not, I don't know. I'll be interested to hear what our resident methodologists think.
So for me, the volume of the size, so the size of the corpus of over 2,000 articles for full text review is just a beast, right? Like there's no physical way a research team, unless you have copious, as you pointed out, Linda, unless you have a lot of money behind you, you're not going to be able to do that. But so this gave me some cause for pause, because my first reaction whenever I do a lit review and have those kinds of numbers, the first instinct for me is I have to go back to my inclusion-exclusion criteria, and something needs to change because my N is too big. My net is so big, I'm capturing things that I don't need to be capturing. And if you look at their inclusion-exclusion criteria, they really are huge. Like the terms they use are very broad. They got everything. So I would have started there. And I think that, for their purposes, I'm sure they had reasons for not doing it. But I think for our listeners, if you ever find yourself with a lit review where your N of inclusion articles is over 2,000, if it's over 1,000, like if you're doing a full text review and you're looking at 1,000, go back to your inclusion-exclusion criteria. There's got to be something in there where you can help narrow it down. The other part for me, I do have some concerns about sampling. That did flag for me as well. But what flagged for me was that part of the way that they chose different papers was to look at the abstracts because they were looking for thematic variation in themes that were being addressed. And, this is more of a reflection moment for myself, a reflexive moment, because I hate writing abstracts. Like of all the pieces of a paper, the abstract is the bane of my freaking existence, because I've already said it, Like I'm done. And now you want me to summarize it and not use the same words I used in my paper. So for me, abstracts are just, if there's a chat GPT for, here's my paper, give me an abstract, that's what I'm going to use chat GPT.
There is. It's called chat GPT.
Chat GPT.
Yeah, but do I have to give it, will it read my paper and then spit it out as an abstract?
Yes, that's exactly what I'll do.
See, there's my chat GPT moment, because honestly, abstracts are evil. But if you're going to base your selection on abstracts and the themes presented therein, boy, you better, you're putting a lot of faith in those abstracts. That's one of the linchpins of this argument, of this paper, is that the abstracts of each manuscript have sufficient details and descriptions of the themes within them, so that you can say this one's significantly different from that one. And I just, the lesson I'm taking away from this is I got to work on my abstract writing skills, because mine probably wouldn't do that. Think about your keywords in that. But that is also for me one of the flags and methods of, boy, I hope all those abstracts were written by people who are better at it than I am.
All right, so I'll take it on. I'm going to take a different approach. I didn't have a problem with the way they chose their sample. They're trying to get their arms around the entire literature. And so I like the idea that they went really broad. If they had gone with their exclusion criteria saying we only want to see empirical studies informed by data, then a lot of the issues around feasibility and operations, justice and transparency, equity and diversity and inclusion, we might have missed some of that. And I'm foreshadowing some of the results that are coming, because a lot of that's happening in commentaries and in opinion pieces and editorials. And so the issues facing resident selection might have been narrowed. And so you can get a very, 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 very refined set of inclusion criteria and end up with 20 papers. And then you truly don't have a scoping review. Now, there's a Goldilocks phenomenon that needs to happen. And so we can debate whether their inclusion criteria was just perfect or not. But I'm going to, at this point, because they're trying to get their arms around the literature, and say, I like a broader inclusion criteria. Your part, Lara, about whether abstracts are reflective of the paper, that's an author criteria, and it's supposed to be it. And that's how it stands alone. And that's where many of us will read the first version of your paper and decide to want to see it more or not. And if you're doing a bad representation in your abstract, then you're doing a disservice to your research. And so that's a phenomenon I don't think we need to blame these authors for challenging. The final part about is the sample of less than 4% sufficient in terms of doing 100 papers. They did their best to say, listen, let's do a random sample of the papers that are available. Then let's try to find variability, and then let's random sample again to see if anything changes. And they said, hey, we're achieving theoretical sufficiency. They note the limitations, say, you know what, if we'd have read everything, we might have found a little bit here or there. But if we're going to criticize them for that, then we need to criticize all the clinical trialists who said, you know what, we did a random sample of 500 patients and we enrolled them in this study, and we think that they represent the larger population. We think that randomization in this case was generous and gave us a result that's generalizable. And I think they're trying to make the same kind of argument here, that these are representative and reflective of the larger literature, but you never can know perfectly. And I'm okay with it. And I've seen this methodology before, and I don't think this is particularly new. But I'll leave it to the Papers Podcast audience to say, does this resonate with you? What do you think of the trustworthiness of the results? Speaking of results, let's jump to what they found. More than 3/4 of the papers have been published in the last 2 years, with more than 2/3 coming from the US. And I wonder if this is just a reflection of the whole publish or perish phenomenon that we're seeing, with a particular emphasis in North America. Every time I read some kind of synthesis, the first line is, where is stuff coming from? And it's always North American dominant, and it's always a recency effect. Very few studies evaluated the effectiveness of a process, nor did they identify the underlying principles that were influencing selection. So no one was asking the question, did it work? And hardly anyone was asking why it worked. It's more a question of, here's a problem, or here's something we did. It didn't have the more fundamental answers that we might hope the literature can provide us with, which is, here's what's working and here's the principles that are at play. They found 5 perspectives on PGME selection, i.e., what's valued depending on your lens. How do you set up resident selection? What's a priority for you as an institution or as a candidate? I'll go through them quickly, and then we'll do a round table for people to respond to as to what it is. I'll tell you, there's lots of data in this results section, and so I'm going to do a bit of a disservice in the 20 minutes that we have for this podcast to capture it. So the first way, or the first value for resident selection, is to use a metric to predict performance. It's the idea of predictive validity, of a grade or a score in terms of your success in achieving milestones or your rank order list within your residency program. But there's also the struggle of, how do you measure things like professionalism and communication if we're using metrics that are numbers? And how really what you're trying to do is, can I avoid selecting candidates who are going to require a heavy lift in terms of remediation? That's that value statement. The second approach is to do a competitive comparison to find the best applicant, do normative identification of who are the top performers. And that's assuming you look backwards rather than forwards. The person who did best in medical school is going to do best in residency. Those are very different contexts. And so there might be a bit of a slip in the argument or reasoning there. And the real problem is all the heterogeneous data that we have makes this really challenging. How do we standardize these types of assessments? A third perspective on selecting for residency is to find the right fit between the program and the applicant. But that requires a lot of transparency between programs and applicants. And I wonder if that's why Eric Warm is spending so much time interviewing one-on-one residents, as you alluded to there, Jason. But it also has a bit of attention required to say, what is specific to this residency program? What are the attributes that we're training for? And how does that match in what you've had in generalist medical school training? The fourth perspective looks at identifying and mitigating bias and ensuring diversity. Can we focus on what society needs, which is a diversified workforce? Can we address upstream bottlenecks that limit diverse applicant pools? By the time we're getting to resident selection, we may have already introduced so many unconscious and structural roadblocks that the issues of equity, it's really hard to fix a process that's been disrupted inappropriately far upstream. And then the last way of perceiving resident selection is to look just simply at logistics of the process. Can we, if you are a program, revamp that labor-intensive, non-scalable process where you have so many applicants? How do you get them to your site for in-person interviews? And what does that mean for the cost of the program into the applicant? For applicants, it's a question of, well, where's the issues of standardization and transparency? How do I know that it's not some chair of a department that's tapping their friends on the shoulders to say, you've been chosen for this program? So the literature offers different ways or different values or what's important about organizing resident selection. And there's 5 major ways, as you've heard me articulate based on the work of the authors. Lara, Linda, Jason, what stood out for you? What would you highlight? What would you redline?
What really bothers me about these findings, John, is the internal contradiction across them, right? So in one theme, we hear the age-old problem that we can't measure factors that really matter. So the measures are problematic as part of the data set. Another part of the data set says the metrics that we do have are discriminatory towards certain populations. So the numbers are a problem. The next theme says there's so many applicants and this process is so huge, we have to rely more on numbers. So I find myself in this really frustrated situation where the system, there's a call for more measurement, then there's a call to know that the measurements are biased, and then there's a reminder that because we had to get this done, we're going to rely on the numbers. Like it's the left hand is eating the right hand. The themes within it demonstrate to us the extent to which this system is broken. We know our quantitative measures don't work. We know we need holistic, and I also know we can't do it. So I think what these results really show to me, and what I find incredibly bothersome, is that we need some brave soul out there to start talking and pushing and saying the whole system needs to move. Like this, what we're doing isn't working.
Yeah, I'll agree with you on that. And I also think maybe because it wasn't in the literature, or maybe it's in the way that they interpreted the themes, that some of those personal things, knowing the person who wrote the letter, that type of thing, didn't come out in here. So I'm not sure that all of the themes came out. The second thing when I look at these results is it reminds me of a paper we did a couple of sessions ago looking at the value of funding for medical education development using the VMA method. And in fact, it's somewhat similar to this. There's the individual, the society, the institution, the financial value, and that sort of thing. So I'm wondering if they'd actually looked at the literature with that lens, whether something different might have come out.
All right. So, these 5 themes, I don't think any of them are shocking. As outraged as Lara is, I do think that's the current state of how things work and so on. I was, it sort of made me reflect on scoping reviews and thematic analyses. It just reminds me that it's a human endeavor, and you can lump and split these in a variety of ways, right? So I was really struck that the high level themes didn't pull out issues of specialty choice, which I think are recurring issues all over the world. And then the other one was just the learner voice seemed lost in this taxonomy. Where's all the wellness issues? Where's all the sort of learner perspective of this journey? I realize that there's some sub themes amongst all of them. One of the ones that Linda mentioned is subbed under something else. But I think those are high level big themes from any perspective, from societal perspective or whatever. So I just thought that it struck me as odd that those 2 high level themes weren't present.
I guess the take home that I had for me is a reminder that when we jump into a problem, we assume that our perspective or the way that we've organized the problem space is common amongst everyone. And this is a great example that we don't always see in a scoping review, is that there is at least 5, and you could probably articulate even more or less than 5, depending on how you pulled up their subs or not, of the different ways of articulating what the issue is. And it's a great reminder, and I think it helps us to, I guess the meta, if we wanted to extend past resident selection to others, is to say we need to be thoughtful about what is our assumption, what are the principles that we are eschewing as we move forward with our research agenda. If you say, oh, resident selection is really only a function of logistics, how do we get our applicant pool manageable? You forget that resident selection is also an issue of equity, or resident selection is also an issue of just comparison of how do I find the best person. And so each of those starts with an assumption and a premise. And often that line of reasoning is lost for many of us when we jump into our scholarly work. And so I like that as a way of, I guess that's the meta that I take from us. Remembering what's the assumption? What am I standing on before I even get to my research question? We're going to go to a round of votes, but before that, I'm going to just read the conclusion from the authors. I'll give them the last word. And they said, this scoping review provides insight into the value statements that describe postgraduate selection. These statements provide a window into assumptions and subsequent implications. It's clear that comparison of applicants is key to each value statement. However, each of these approaches centers a different stakeholder or group at the expense of others. And Lara, that gets back to what you were articulating. These ways of approaching resident selection are in conflict with each other. There's a little side note, I guess I'd offer to the listeners, that this is a RIME paper, Research in Medical Education paper. If you're not familiar with that, this is an annual special edition of Academic Medicine that draws from research presented at the AAMC meeting. And Lara, who's been a chair of one of their meetings, and I've worked on that board with her as well, we're well familiar with this. But if you're not familiar with RIME, then it's a great option each year to get a very tight compendium of the hot topics in HPE that's curated, peer-reviewed, and you can either hear the papers presented at the RIME meeting, or you can read them when they are put together as a special issue in academic medicine. So with that, let's turn to our round of votes. We'll go with our methods question in terms of 1 to 5 for this synthesis. What say you? Lara, Linda, Jason?
So if I have to put a number, even though I don't believe in these numbers, I'm trying to think of how I can monkey with it this time, just to give you guys a hard time.
I'm going to just turn your mute off, and I will overdub a number that I like. Right? That's the state of the current affair that I'm prepared to do.
Just glad we're clearing that up. I'm going to give it a 4. I think it's really well done. There are a couple of places I would have liked some more detail, but I think it's better than average.
I'm going to give it a 4 as well. I was sort of tending towards 5 now that John has explained all the complexities of the sampling process. But as Lara said, it's above average when you're doing normative rating.
I think it's a great paper, great method section, super clear writing. All the authors are giants. I do quibble with the sampling. So I'm going to give it a 4 as well. But it was my idea first before Lara said it.
I don't know how you guys get to 5. Then if you guys are giving this a 4, I think, angels dancing on the heads of pins might be an exercise that you all engage with. I'm going to give this a 5. I don't see what to quibble with, but I think they put it together well. And they clearly articulate it. I'll go back to my earlier comment, which is, if you want to see a worked example of a nice synthesis, this is a good example of a scoping review. And they articulate a couple little side elements. Go ahead, Linda.
Jason, I noticed that in your criteria for what level you were going to give it, whereas the giantnesses of the authors. Do you really think that's important? I mean, you could have somebody write a fantastic methods section, and just because you don't know them shouldn't mean you knock them down.
No, it's not a criteria. It's a notwithstanding. That's what I said. Notwithstanding the fact that these are all giants.
back to the point that the ranking doesn't mean anything.
So anyway,
okay.
By the way,
right.
There is something else at play here. I seem to remember at Amy in Glasgow that the first author, Holly Creditwire, I think she paid for your dinner, John. Isn't that right? And suddenly there's a 5. How did that happen?
I am open for business. Paper podcast listeners, I love swag. I am a 34, 32 long. I don't know what here's my Vimeo account. Please. Patreon, John. All of it. I'm going to get rich from medical education eventually. At least $5 or $6. All right. Educational impact. Does this change your worldview on resident selection? We'll go reverse order. Let's see who can remember who went first and last this time.
I was first, so I'm last. I don't know anybody else.
Jason, that's you.
No.
Did you see that?
Yeah.
1 second.
Yeah.
No.
I didn't. You went third.
It's like test. It is. You know what? If you're playing at home, this would be a great drinking game. Like seeing if everybody can remember what they're doing. All right, Dr. Frank, hit it.
They're going to change the mini mental for Jason.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was in REM sleep there. This is a 4. So I'll just tell you why. I'll tell you why this is a 4, because I really like that someone has produced a typography, a taxonomy of the recurring issues in the literature. But because it doesn't resonate with me fully, I'm giving it a 4. Like if I was doing a task force on improving selection for residency, I think there's some things missing. So it's a 4.
I'm sort of hesitating between a 3 and a 4. It's good paper, and it certainly brings up perspectives that are perspectives. And, you can take one or more than one of them if you're going to do some work in this area. Does it address anything new to me? Will it be something that I'll pull out? Actually, I'm going to go with a 4 because I think I can pull it out in terms of methods. In terms of the actual content, 3.
I'm going to give it a 4.5.
Not allowed.
Why is it not allowed? Fine, then I'll round up to 5.
It's an ordinal scale. We've talked about this before.
Ordinal, and then I'll give it a 5. I'll round up. Because I think one of the things about this paper, I walked away feeling like I actually had a sense of, potential solutions. You could make a selection process that consists of different subcommittees. Each subcommittee works in isolation and takes a different focus. So be it diversity, be it fit, be it metrics, whatever. They make rankings in isolation, then we cross-compare to rank. I'm not saying it's easy, and I am saying it's a lot of work, but I walked away with this with a sense. I think they answered the research question well, and I think it's applicable. And the only other thing I'm going to add, John, to your point about the RIME committee, the Research and Medical Education Committee that's part of the AAMC, is that if you're interested in one day being an editor of a journal, you can sit on the RIME committee. There's every year annually, there's a call for volunteers to come and sit in the RIME committee. And on the RIME committee, you act as an editor of that edition of Academic Medicine. And you get the evaluations or the feedback from reviewers, you make decisions. So if you want to sort of test drive that role before you decide if this is something you want to do, I highly recommend sitting on that committee.
I feel like you're paid advertisement, which is getting in the way of my Patreon views. So I'm going to give this paper a 5 as well. Sometimes you read it and say, oh, I was hoping for the clouds to part and light to shine down from heaven and tell me what to do. And what this paper does is says, listen, there's not a lot of did it work and why did it work type of data. And so we're a little bit of, the light's shining down, but it feels like we need to change the batteries a little bit. It's not as powerful. That's not a function of the authors. It's a function of the state of literature. But what they tell us is there's a whole bunch of writing and scholarship in this area. And even though it's not an area of interest particular to me, it's obvious an area of big interest to the larger HPE community. And even for scholars, I imagine for everyone running a residency program, what this literature can tell them is really important. And so for getting their arms around what is just a massive literature and helping to organize it in a way and to remind us that the way we see it implies a certain value statement that we need to make obvious and transparent rather than just proceeding forward as if we're not going to question our own assumptions. For that, I think this paper really does a nice job. And so I would give this paper to a program director or someone who's about to engage in some scholarship. I'd be like, whoa, let's slow our horses. There's already 2,200 papers in this domain. What do you have to say that's new and expands upon that? And here's one way to organize it. And for that reason, I think it's really important. It's a 5. So there you have it. We'd love to hear from you as to what you think about this. You can reach us at thepaperspodcast@gmail.com. You can find us at paperspodcast.com and find our archives. You can find our abstracts there. We'd love to hear from you. What's a issue that you're facing? What's a paper that you want to hear? And with that, thanks for listening.
Talk to you later.
Linda, you're on mute. And that was Lara's laugh, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.
Oh, that was fun.
You've been listening to the Papers Podcast. We hope we made you just slightly smarter. The podcast is a production of the Unit for Teaching and Learning at the Karolinska Institutet. The executive producer today was my friend Teresa Sörö. The technical producer today was Samuel Lundberg. You can learn more about the Papers Podcast and contact us at www.thepaperspodcast.com. Thank you for listening, everybody, and thank you for all you do. Take care.